you remember Dr. Decker from the Kalamazoo State Hospital? I said, oh yeah. He said, well, he's writing a book on the history of the Kalamazoo State Hospital. He's been meeting with some of us who work there, and he's been putting his book together, and I said, wow, that's really neat. So I sent him an email. This is Dr. Decker. I sent him an email kind of late at night, and the next morning I look at my emails. 2 in the morning, I got a response from him. Hey, hadn't seen or talked to him in 28 years. Hey Jim, great to hear from you, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm sorry, you didn't say blah, blah, blah. But we're leaving for Iowa a little later this morning, but I'll get back to you as soon as we get back. And anyway, that's kind of reflective of who he is, and then around. He's working on that book, and I provide just a little bit of stuff for that. And then he wrote his Traverse City history book and Traverse City State Hospital, and I contributed just a little bit to that and was in regular contact with him. And then I said, hey, I do an annual photo show in Newberry on the 4th of July. I said, would you like to come on up to my photo show and talk to people and, for preparation for work on the Newberry book? I said, yeah, we'll be there. Written 3 books since 08, 10, and 12. Is that right, Greta? Traverse City, Newberry, Kalamazoo, 08, 10, and 12. And wait, I will put Yak in here and let you go on from here.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for that very effusive introduction, Jim, and I need that for future reference. Well, I'm delighted to be up here in the Sioux once again. The last time I was here, or the first time I was here, it was under some different circumstances. One of your citizens had shot the editor of your newspaper. You remember that? Well, his attorney hired me to advise her as to whether he was responsible for that act, or whether he was mentally unresponsible. Many people think that because somebody is mentally ill, that then they can kill people at leisure or pleasure. Well, that's not true. To meet the criteria for legal insanity, you ought not only have to be mentally ill, but you have to not know the difference between right and wrong, or if you do, that you're not capable of adhering to the right. And, I saw a young man in Coldwater many years ago, and he...
Keep talking.
Yeah. And he had killed the father of his girlfriend, and he was pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. But unfortunately, I had to excuse him because he was receiving messages from God that told him to do this. And there was no question about his insanity. He had been a strange fellow for some time, and the citizens were concerned about him, but nobody did anything about it. That's the unfortunate thing sometimes, that people are deranged and they don't take the appropriate action, and then things like this happen. And I must say that currently the present statutes are such that it's difficult sometimes to get care, get the proper attention for people that are having mental problems. We used to say that it was easy to get into the state hospital, but hard to get out. It's the reverse today. It's hard to get in, and you're only there for a few days and you're out. So we see some of these sorts of things. I've seen many instances where people didn't get the care that they should have gotten on a timely basis, and some very serious tragedies happen, not only to them and their family, but the community and others as well. Well, with that brief introduction to our arrival here in the Sioux, let me cite a few people today that have been very helpful in the production of this manuscript. Jim has been extremely helpful. He's a hard man. He really drives somebody to do something. I'm not going to judge the quality of his drivenness, but I can give him the credit for driving people on to do something. He had provided me with a lot of the textual material as well as the prints, and you see many of these around the room here. Now later on I have a slideshow here, and the pictures that I have here, I try to pick out some that are not in the book so that you see some different ones. And of course that will motivate you to buy the book so that you see the ones that are there. And also my wife, who has been extremely helpful, not only in producing this book and the other two books as well as Kalamazoo and Traverse City, and who excused me from the many menial chores at home, in the house and out on the yard and things like that, and chauffeured me around to different libraries like the Historical Library in Lansing and many other places. Then Steve Schreier over here, our video man. Steve was my video production person at the Kalamazoo State Hospital while I was superintendent there for 13 years. Prior to that, he was there for about 15 years when his father was the superintendent of the hospital. So he was there for 28 years and has been extremely helpful in getting some of the photos and getting them into the books, etc. Unfortunately, Steve had an accident yesterday, an automobile accident, and his car was totaled, and he was hospitalized at the Newberry Hospital overnight. He miraculously escaped serious injury, just sustaining a few lacerations. If you saw his car, you would never believe what I said. But at any rate, so we picked him up, and he insisted on being with us tonight and videotaping this program, which he has done for all of the other programs, many programs that I have given around the state for the other two hospitals. Now with those comments, let's get to the Newberry State Hospital. That's our subject tonight. Well, before 1848, the mentally ill people suffered these kinds of fates. If they continued to live with their family and they were difficult to manage, they usually banished them from the house and built a shack out and back and locked them up in there. They lived life in those shacks. If they were not difficult to manage, and they no longer were persona desirable at home, they were allowed to roam around the communities. If they were difficult and dangerous, they were locked up in jails. And in the jails, they were usually chained to the walls or to the floor, and so on and so forth. But in 1848, a young lady, Dorothea Lynn Dix, was a school teacher, and on Sunday she would go to the jails around Boston, and she saw the deplorable conditions of the mentally ill. They weren't bathed, they weren't fed nutritious foods, they weren't very well clothed, and so you can imagine all the other things, how they were treated. They were not considered humane, they were considered to be animals, so they treated them like animals, beat them and mistreated them in every way you could think possible. Well, she went on a crusade at the legislatures around the countryside, and she convinced most of the states that were in existence at that time to build asylums for the mentally ill. That pricked the conscience of the governor in Michigan, and the legislature in 1849 indicated that they would build an asylum. And they decided that the asylum would be built in Kalamazoo. They wanted it away from the populous centers, you know. So they got it out on the western extremity of the state over in Kalamazoo. Kalamazoo was a village at that time. And the villagers thought, well, gee, this is pretty good. We're going to have this asylum here. And they first donated 10 acres of land to the asylum. Then some of the city says, hey, we don't want those crazies here in our village. So they decided to donate the land to the village. And the village said, well, we're not going to have them here. But there was a lawyer, Stewart was his name, and he said, well, I got 106 acres of land way out of the village here. I'll give you that. You can set them out there and we'll be free of those crazy people forever. Well, of course, as time went by, you know, Kalamazoo is growing around the hospital. It's now in almost the center of the city. But anyway, getting back to the story, so the first asylum was built at Kalamazoo, and it opened in 1859. Almost the number of people, insane people, at that time, that's what they called them at that time, either lunatics or insane people. A tap of the population. What do you think the population of Michigan was in 1859? Anybody venture a guess? No, I'll tell you, it was 750,000. And there were 423 mentally ill considered. They opened the hospital in 1859, or the asylum at that time, and they thought that would be adequate, you know. They built it for 400 people, so it was 23 short already. But they opened it and opened one building over there, and that building accommodated both male and female patients. Soon they recognized that wasn't enough, so in 1874 they built another building similar to the first one. Then in the middle of it, between those two buildings, they built another building. That building they reserved for administrative purposes. Usually in the basement they had the kitchen and the dining room. On the first floor would be the doctor's offices, the office for the matron, and the pharmacy and things like that. Second floor was reserved for the medical officers, and the third floor was the residence of the superintendent. He had the entire third floor, he and his family. You know, until 1976, all medical officers by law were required to live on the hospital grounds. They, and at Kalamazoo, when I arrived at Kalamazoo in 1953, that is at the hospital, I began my employment there in 1953. Doctors were still living in the buildings that patients lived in. And I was fortunate that in 1952, they decided that they were going to build some little homes, ranch homes across the street from the hospital, but it was on hospital property. So they were still comporting with the law. They built 4 ranch homes, and there was one old farm home out there, large, from 40 by 60, big place at one time, housed some female patients. And they did that in order to try and attract some young doctors to the hospital, because the young ones the new ones wouldn't come and live in the patient building. It was understandable, you know. Their children, they had children, and to live in this building, they're restricted from the community. The interaction with the community was difficult, and of course there was a tremendous stigma. You know, you're living in there with those nuts, those crazy people, how can you keep from getting nuts yourself, you know? So they built these ranch houses on the grounds there. Well, to get back to the story then, as I said, when they opened the place, it was already oversubscribed. It wasn't until 1870s, early in the 1870s, that we've got to do more than this. We just can't accommodate them all on the western side of the state. So they built the second asylum at Pontiac, and that opened in 1878. Well, that was also going to accommodate 400 patients. This time, primarily, they would divide the state in half. The Michigan Asylum at Kalamazoo would now become the Western Michigan Asylum, and Pontiac would become the Eastern Michigan Asylum. Well, the same story repeated itself, you know. Soon it was filled. The population in Michigan increased very rapidly, and so they got the legislature in 1882 to approve the establishment of the establishment of a third asylum. This time, where to put it? Well, the citizens up north said, hey, you know, it's about time you get one up here. So they built the third one in Traverse City. And then that one was called Northern Michigan Asylum at Traverse City. Excuse me. Well, at that time also, these asylums were accepting not only insane people, but they also accepted the mentally retarded, the epileptic, and the criminals that were considered to be mentally ill. So, and anything else that the community didn't have another place for went to the asylum. So, you know, not so many years ago, I read an article about somebody writing that this was a very sad tale because they found somebody in Coldwater that was not retarded, was not mentally ill. Well, Coldwater, for a period of time, was a children's residential center set up by the state, and they sent orphans to Coldwater. So sure enough, when later the state converted it to a home, Coldwater State Home for Retarded Children. Well, then some people discovered later that some of these people in there were not retarded, and they were critical of the hospital and its management. They weren't at fault. It was the state legislature that was at fault, for not building orphanages for children, but sending them to a place where they didn't belong. Well, anyway, getting back to the story now, we got 3 asylums, right? Well, no, we got 4. In 1885, at the same time the Traverse City Hospital was opened, they decided it's time to get the criminals out of the insane asylums. So they built the Ionia State Hospital for the criminally insane. That hospital continued to be in existence at Ionia until 1967, when they moved the forensic center to the old Ypsilanti State Hospital. When the new drugs came out in 1955, the populations in these hospitals began to drop. So as the population began to drop, there were some vacant spaces. They had some vacant spaces there, so they took them out of the Riverside Center, was called at that time, or the former Ionia State Hospital, moved them over to the Forensic Center at Ypsilanti. Well, now what? Now what to do? They got we got now 5, right? 5 asylums. We got, we got 4. Okay, they filled up. Same old story. The population grows in the state. The ratio of those that are mentally ill remains the same to the general population. The number of people out of 1,000 that are insane remains the same. So the population of the state, so does the population of the mentally ill in the state increase. So now they finally decide to build the fifth one. And of course, what had been happening, where did the people in the Upper Peninsula go when they became mentally ill? Where'd they go? What do you do with them? Well, they were shipped over to Traverse City or to Pontiac. But it was very expensive, you know, to bring them over. Females had to have male and female escorts, and it was costing $85 to $150, which was a fortune at that time, you know. So the people in the Upper Peninsula said, hey, it's about time we get one up here. You got 4 down there, and we deserve a break up here. So they agreed to build it up here. Now, why Newberry? Why did they choose Newberry? Well, there was a lot of competition and a lot of skullduggery going on. There were fights and charges from one editor of the news to another, you know. But finally, they decided on Newberry, and they decided on Newberry primarily because it had a good source of pure water, and there were lots of people available to work in the Newberry. But you know, you had Newberry enjoyed a distinct privilege, and Newberry was never labeled a Newberry Asylum. It was from the outset called the Upper Peninsula Hospital. And that came about because before that time, not much was known about the cause of the mentally ill. And now, with the discovery of the microscope and the discovery of physical ailments, that many of them were caused by bacteria, the scientists began to say, hey, we better take a look at the brains and spinal cords of these people and see if there's some bug there that's causing mentally ill. And you know, by golly, they did. They did find a bug up there. At that time, about 20% of the people that were coming into the insane asylums had syphilis of the brain. And in 1904, a Japanese investigator found a bug that was causing it. It was a little corkscrew organism that was in the brain that was the cause of this illness. Okay, now we found the cause of one of the mental illness. What are we going to do about it? Well, it wasn't much that they could do about it, but finally, after a few years, they discovered that that bug was very sensitive to heat. Couldn't tolerate much over the 98.6 temperature of the body. But if they increased that temperature up to 104, 106, it would kill this bug. So how to get the temperature up that high? Well, electricity came in 1894, and so they decided, well, we get a cabinet. It was a big cabinet, and they put light bulbs in there to produce heat. And it was called a Burdick cabinet. Had a whole range of light bulbs that produced that heat, drove the temperature up to 104, 160, killed the bugs, stopped the continuation of the illness, but remember, it already done some damage, and that damage couldn't be repaired, but there was no further progress, movement of the disease. Sometime later, it was discovered that, hey, another way to do that is take blood from somebody who has malaria. And they have these spells, you know, these fevers up and down, these fevers. So they just take that blood from somebody that has malaria, inject that into them, and they'll have these fevers, and sure enough, it worked. Well, then you terminate it with quinine, you know, the episode, stop the paroxysm of malaria, of their fever episode. And that was curative too. Then what happened? Next, in the march toward eradication of insanity, well, somebody decided that hey, we ought to do something with these people that are drinking too much. We're getting a lot of alcoholics, and they come into the hospital emergency room here. They're socked up, and how do we get them out of this? So they don't develop the DTs and withdrawal symptoms. And somebody noticed that they were using insulin to get these people back on track. And then they noticed that some of the mentally ill that were drinking too much, it also had a good effect on their mental symptoms. So we started using insulin Coma. Now, insulin does what? It's used for what? It's used for treatment of diabetes, right? And if you take regular insulin, you may take 20, 25 units of insulin, right, a day. Well, we started with 5 units. They didn't go into coma, you give them 10. They didn't go into coma, you give them 40, you give them 20. They didn't go into coma, you give them 40, then 60, 80, and so you kept doubling them. And some of them got as much as 200, 300 units of insulin before they went into coma. You'd have them in coma for a half an hour, then you would terminate them. And it was beneficial, it was helpful. However, very costly. You gotta have a nurse, you gotta have, when somebody is unconscious, they're in a coma, somebody's gotta be there all of the time observing. They may slip in an irreversible state. You got to see that doesn't happen. And then how do you terminate them? Well, you slip a needle in their vein and give them a good dose of glucose, or you pass a tube in their nose and down into the stomach, and you pour some orange juice or whatever, it's got glucose in it, and you terminate the coma that way. The next step in the management of the mentally ill was shock treatment, electrical shock treatment. There were 2 investigators in Italy that, there had been some use of electricity before that time, around the turn of the century, but it was not shock treatment. It was one of the causes that was offered for mental symptoms was that there was a weakness of the nerves. Some of you probably know neurasthenia. I heard that term, neurasthenia. So-and-so has neurasthenia, meaning weakness of the nerves. So somebody said, well, maybe we can stimulate those nerves and make them strong again. So they were using electrical currents, and just a very small amperage, and sure enough, it would stimulate the electrical of the nerves and make them a little stronger. And some patients that were depressed were improved. So these 2 guys in Italy said, well, maybe if we applied that directly to the brain, that might help. So they, instead of using one electrode, they used an electrode on each temple, and used a small amperage for a fraction of a second, and many patients, my gosh, did improve, and their symptoms were relieved, and they were able to leave the asylums. However, when it was first introduced, it could be very traumatic. It produces an epileptic convulsion, with shaking of the arms and legs and so on and so forth, and occasionally fractures of the vertebrae and fractures of the arms or legs. So the next step was to ameliorate that a little bit, and decided that we'll anesthetize them. So we used a little bit of pentothal, put them to sleep. Well, that was helpful, but not sufficient. Then came along somebody said, well, we're using curare, the drug that poison that the Indians used to put on the tips of their arrows to kill their deer, etc. And but there was a synthetic product called succinylcholine, and you could use that. That was very good. I provided a lot of shock treatment from, let's see, I began that in 1959 and continued to about 1972. And what I would do is inject the patient with a little bit of pentothal. They would relax when they were asleep. Then I would inject a little succinylcholine, and that would relax them. And then I administer the treatment. There was no movement. There was no risk of breaking, rupturing, or fracturing any of the vertebrae or the arms or legs. The only thing is that you had to be sure that that you got the right dose of the nicotine, or they had difficulty getting to breathe, get on their own. On one instance, then the new drugs came in 1955, and that was really the only revolution that we have had in psychiatry, save that for the management of syphilis. Nothing else was that useful. These drugs came in 1955. Now, I'm going to have to tell you my first experience with them. There was a salesman from the Ciba Pharmaceutical Company. He was in the hospital. He had his table, his display of his drugs, and he had this one little tube there. He was squeezing this out, and he says, "This stuff will take all the hair off of your body, you know." And he said, "I had a little bit on my fingers here the other day, and I forgot about it. I rubbed my hand over my head. Look at me, all balled up here on the top of my head." I said, "Listen, fella, we don't need anything to take the hair off our patients. We needed something to straighten out the minds of these people. Hey, listen, our company is working on a drug, and I got a bunch of those pills with me. Now, I'm going to give them to you, but don't you ever tell anybody where you got them, because it's still in the research." So he gave them to me. We had a farmer from Wayland. This man became mentally ill, and he wouldn't eat, he wouldn't drink, he wouldn't feed himself, he wouldn't get out of bed. His wife had to do everything for him. So he sent him to us at the state hospital in Kalamazoo. And I had these pills, and I said, "I'm going to grind them up, and I'm going to put them in the liquid food that we gave him. You know, we're going to push it, pour it down the rubber tube into his stomach, and my God, in 3 days this guy was out of bed, walking around talking and feeding himself, and his catatonia had been completely reversed. Well, we kept him there for 2 or 3 weeks. He went home back to his farm, and our social service department kept in touch with him. He never had another mental symptom, stayed out of the hospital. That particular drug was, we were very pleased with it. It was developed by the Indians, the East Indians, and they were using it very successfully. But they didn't get out with their medical societies, you know, and promote this drug until finally one of them gave an address in England, and they were quite impressed and tried it. They were impressed with it. Then it spread over to this country here. Unfortunately, it had some undesirable effects, you know, like most drugs do or all do. And some patients, if they took it for a long period of time, would become severely depressed and suicidal. Others would develop some disturbance with their blood vessels and bleed, particularly in their stomach. Then a new one came in from France. They were looking for a drug to calm people down when they were given ether anesthesia. Any of you remember ether anesthesia? Yeah. Okay, what do you remember about it? Well, when they start giving you ether, people get excited, restless, and so forth, until they got to sleep. The same thing happened when they started to awake from the ether. They would get restless and noisy, and they'd have to hold them down or tie them down for a little while. So the French were looking for something to ease that up for them. They come across this drug. They had some people that also had some mental symptoms. Lo and behold, my God, these mental symptoms cleared up. They were gone. The drugs that we had been using before that were barbiturates, like sodium amytal, seconal, and stuff like that. Well, they calmed you down, but it didn't change your thinking at all. That was the most important thing. Changed it. This did. We had a journal club every Thursday. The doctors would meet, and they each of us had some assignment. We would read these medical journals up, then report on what we had read. That was one of the doctors reported. They said, "Oh yeah, another cure. We're going to empty this out." Lo and behold, it did. That drug was called. The chemical name was chlorpromazine, but the trade name was Thorazine. It's made by SmithKline in French. Very, very helpful. That was just turned things around, There were people at Kalamazoo in the hospital there, and I thought they'd been there for 20 years, they'll never leave here. I got in 2 or 3 months, they were out. They're out of the hospital. One lady was tube fed 10 years. I fed her for 6 months when one of the other doctors was on an extra duty for me. Tube fed her. I'd get that tube up to her nose and get it down there and pour just a little bit, and the only thing she'd ever say, "That's enough." No, was enough, I gave her all the rest of her feeding. But when these drugs came in, I gave her, it was Thorazine at that time. I gave her some Thorazine. Lo and behold, it took her a little longer than the Wayland farmer, but she did get out of bed. She started walking. She went back to her family. All of her children were grown, and she lived with one of her daughters. She had a little relapse after she'd been out of the hospital for a year and a half. She came back for a few weeks, went back home. She had 4 years later, she died. But no more recurrence after that first one. Now, then, with all of this, what to do with all of these people? When I came to Kalamazoo in 1953, we had 3,600 patients. And of course, we weren't the only hospital, as we said, we already had Pontiac, Traverse City, and Newberry. And then we had, beyond that, Ypsilanti, Northville, and so we had thousands of patients. Ypsilanti Hospital at one time was the largest, 4,400 patients. Now, these people are cured. At Kalamazoo, we had the 3,600. Then when these drugs came, we had these people that had been restless, argumentative, troublesome, now docile as a lamb. And their mind was clear. They didn't belong, they needed to be there. Where to go? Mom and dad are gone, they're dead. Brothers and sisters are married, they can't take them. And they won't take them. No place to go. Well, I went down and talked to a manager of a residential hotel that we had in Kalamazoo. And I asked him if he would take 6 of our patients. "Oh no, we can't have crazies in the hotel over here. We can't do that." Well, I finally convinced him, and they had been there for a couple of months, and he said, "Hey, send me some more." Well, pretty soon, we owned the hotel, you might say. He said, we're not taking any more people other than patients from your hospital. So now it's that was a Rickman Hotel. It's now entirely populated by mentally ill patients, you know, that are under treatment, and so it's run by the Community Mental Health Service. But that's pretty much what happened. Now the law was changed in 1974. Before 1974, it was, as I said, fairly easy to get into the hospital. If you filed a petition with the probate court would appoint two physicians to take a look at the person that you alleged was mentally ill. If these physicians certified that in their opinion they were mentally ill, then the judge would schedule a hearing, and if he concurred with you that you were committed to the state hospital for an indefinite period of time. By that time the law had changed somewhat, so that at that time it was 60 days, and then there would be a hearing after the 40th day, and if you still needed it, then you'd be committed maybe for another period of time, and then eventually, if this went on and on, you received what they called a regular order, and there was no time limit on it. It was up to the management of the hospital to decide if you were well enough to be placed out in the community again. But in 1974, the court, Supreme Court, decided that the mental health statutes were unconstitutional, that they had to be replaced, so they were replaced. Now, there was no definition of mental illness really before. Now they defined what mental illness was, and I'm going to be very, take a little credit for this, because the director of the Department of Mental Health, I was the senior man in the mental health department at that time. Dr. Raymond Wagner was a senior at the University of Michigan in the department over there. The director called the two of us into his office. He said, I want you two to come up with a definition. Each of you write a definition. So I wrote one and he wrote one. They took that and gave it to their legal people and put it into legalese. And that's the definition now that they use for mental illness. But just being mentally ill is not enough today. Pretty much you have to show that that individual is likely to hurt you or hurt someone else. That's not always easy to show, so it's very difficult. The probate judges, there are some other conditions available, but the probate judges don't seem to want to use that. And so it's pretty much up to those criteria to get somebody now with mental illness admitted to the hospital. Also at that time, the statute was changed so that the state no longer would be responsible for the care of the mentally ill. Now the counties would. And with the change in attitude toward the mentally ill and the civil rights movement, it was felt that the mentally ill had been denied many of their rights, and they should have equal rights with everyone else. And so that these people, it was very difficult to get them into the hospital. They now are living in residential homes and boarding homes, etc., rather than in a mental institution. However, that's certainly true in the state of Michigan and other states, but not all states. Many of the states have found that there are some people that cannot be managed adequately and satisfactorily in the community. There ought to be a hospital supported by the state of some size. California, and I brought some literature along. I don't have it on the table over there, but I brought some along. How many of you saw the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Okay. That hospital, was condemned, and all of the buildings were torn down, save the main building. That has now been restored to a museum. And new buildings were built. They built a new hospital to accommodate 790 patients for all the whole state of Oregon. Indiana, Illinois have built new hospitals, smaller ones, modern hospitals for the mentally ill, state supported. We haven't done that in Michigan. It's my opinion we should. We're asking too much of the community mental health programs. We needed them. I was an advocate for the community people. We needed that. As I said, we had no place for them to go. Many of them, no reason that they couldn't be independent, live an independent life out in the community like anyone else. But there's some that are so disabled that they really need to be receiving 24 hours of care every day. Okay, now I'm going to stop there, and I have a slideshow here that I'll project. Where's our, over there, okay. Some of the buildings, I'll make a few comments about them. I don't want to spend too much time on that because I want you to ask some questions that you may have that I can answer for you. Okay? Now, let's see. Oh, that building, that's it. That's Newberry. Back in the late 1800s, before it became a village. How many of you remember that? How many of you? Okay. Okay. Well, let's see if I can get back here. No, I guess I'm going the wrong way here. No. All right, well, let me tell you what this one is. Most of the work that was done in the hospitals or asylum was done by patients. The employees generally just supervised the patients. And that was good. First of all, it kept them active, got their minds off of those foreign alien thoughts that they had, kept them in good physical status, and think of the esteem that they achieved working alongside with the employees. And I can't speak for all other institutions, but I can tell you at Kalamazoo that the patients were, the employees considered equal to themselves. The whole attitude over there at the Kalamazoo was a family. The patients and the employees were one large family. At the state, the patients, as I said, did most of the work. They didn't get paid like the prisoners in prison. The prisoners get paid for some of the work they do. That's not true. That wasn't true for the mentally ill patients. They didn't get paid. But the employees were forbidden, to do, but they'd slip them some money. They'd buy them clothes. They would take them home at Easter time, Christmas, buy them Christmas presents, buy clothes for them, etc. Many of the employees would just love these people like their own family. We did have some, of course. Every place you find some rotten apples. Some people like to capitalize that and sensationalize what happened at the hospital. It's not the case at Kalamazoo. I took my internship at Detroit Receiving Hospital. When a mentally disturbed came into the emergency room over there, they were thrown onto a gurney, a leather belt thrown around their waist, and leather cuffs around their ankles and the wrists and fastened to the gurney. I came to Kalamazoo at the state hospital there serendipitously. I finished my internship, and then I got a letter from Uncle Sam. It said, "Dear doctor, when you finish your internship, we need you in Korea." Well, so I went home, and I was tired. You know, I worked on the surgery service when I finished my internship, 84 hours a week. So I rested, then I got tired. I went down to a local hospital trying to get some work with some of the doctors. "We don't want you to be here today and gone tomorrow." But I got a brother up to the state hospital, go see him. So I went to see him. "Sure, we could use you one day or 10 days or whatever." So I went up there. I saw the compassionate care that the employees were giving these patients. So impressed. I decided to not become a cut-up or a surgeon, but go into psychiatry. I took my training at Detroit Psychiatric Institute and went back to Kalamazoo and spent 34 years there. Well, let me rush through these quickly here, if I can. Now we're back. Oh, you know, you got this hospital through efforts like this man here, Claude Case. And Claude Case was a manager of the Vulcan Furnace Company that was started by the first the man who established Newberry, John S. Newberry. And he later became one of the trustees of the hospital and served there until 1905 when he died. Okay, this is one of the couple of the early buildings there. The one on the left turned out to be later on an infirmary. Yeah. There, this was a TB building. We did have patients with tuberculosis. They were segregated from the general population, and this was the TB building that was built at Newberry. And there is the infirmary with the two little towers up there, pyramidal roofs. Some more of the cottages. Well, I wanted to, this is a living quarters. Much nicer living quarters in Newberry than we had at Kalamazoo. Kalamazoo, the huge corridors. Here you had some separations here into little alcoves where patients could spend spare time. And a herd of deer that were on the grounds in the early times. A movement of furniture and stuff from what was used as a temporary library to a library that they finally built. This was their greenhouse. All of these hospitals had greenhouses. Okay. Well, let's skip that. Let me answer some questions for you. I'll skip it, Steve. I'm not familiar with this. This is not my computer. Let me have some questions from you. Yes.
Do you feel there are enough AFCs and such places now that there aren't the big hospitals?
Pardon?
I'm sorry. Do you feel there are enough adult foster care facilities and other facilities like that to take the place of the hospitals that have closed?
Well, I can't answer that for you because I really don't know. However, even if there were, some of these people now have their rights, and they can reject going into these foster homes even though they're available. You can't force them unless you can get a probate judge to do that. You have to convince him that you're not violating his rights, that he has a right to make that decision whether he wants to or not. Just like you have the right. If a doctor tells you you have cancer and you should have your thyroid drained out, and you say, no, I'm not going to do that because I don't think that the chance of cure or alleviation of my distress is going to happen, you can say no. And the court can't force you. You have that right. So does a mental patient now. If he says, no, I don't want to go into that home, yeah, you'll have to go to the court and try and convince them that they're incapable of making that decision. But if the court determines that they're capable, they can wander the street. They can do anything they want, just like any
Until
other
they break a
citizen.
law.
Pardon?
Until they break a law.
Yeah, until they break them. Then, where do they go? Yeah, right. They're in jail. At the present time, the state says that there are about 20% of the people confined to prison are former mental patients. And the federal government reports even a higher number, around 30%. I conducted psychiatric audits of the prisons from 89 to 98. I'd seen the former patients in these cells, and they're with some of the severe criminals who are out there in the general population. And some of these were from Kalamazoo. They throw their arms around me, doctor, take me back to the hospital. No way in the world I could. I'd already retired in the first place, and secondly, the law had changed. Couldn't do it even then. Yeah. Yes.
Dr. Decker, could you talk about the unique architectural style, the Newberry State Hospital, that was different than the others?
Pardon?
The architectural style of the
Oh, yeah,
hospital.
the architectural style of Newberry was a radical change from that of Kalamazoo, Pontiac, and Traverse City. The ones that, those three hospitals were built on what was known as the Kirkbride plan, or the butterfly plan. And what that was you'd have this central building, and that central building, as I said, would house the kitchen and dining room in the basement, and then I told you what was on the other floors. Then at right angles to that would be linear buildings. They were where the wards were built out there to house the male and female patients. That was a butterfly. The central part was the body of the butterfly, and the wings out there, the wards were the wings of the butterfly. Now, at Newberry, the state said we're no longer going to build those kinds of hospitals. They're very costly. And we really can't treat the patient very well in that kind of a setting. We're going to build cottages, which are far better. They were about 1/3 cheaper in the first place, and of course the legislators liked that. It was much cheaper. And secondly, they could segregate patients. These very calm patients who could live in this big building. The disturbed that were troublesome would live in another building, etc. So they said these buildings, we will build 20 of them, and they will be arranged in a quadrangle. So the quadrangle would run there, and they were arranged that way. It was a real departure, much better. At Pontiac and Kalamazoo and Traverse City, after they first built those first linear type buildings, they started building cottages at those, but they were detached from the main buildings. This time they said we're not going to build those main buildings first. we're gonna have all cottages. So Newberry had those distinctions, the change in architecture and the change in name. No longer is Asylum a hospital. And we now will provide some real treatment other than just humane care. There will be some medical treatment for the people in these places. Yes?
I've heard that at times when patients at the Newberry Hospital were calm enough or whatever, that they would be allowed or sent out into the community to work at menial jobs.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Oh, sure. Yes, sure. We had, particularly when these drugs came out, like I said, many of these people, we had, at one time we had an equal number of men and women, about 200 of each, working out in the community. And they lived at the hospital, they just kind of room and board, they're free, of course. At the hospital, they didn't pay anything for their care. But they worked downtown, they had responsible jobs. One of them was the secretary to the president at the college for a while, and some worked in banks. They were very responsible people, and excellent jobs. Motel clerks.
Who collected their pay?
Yeah,
Did they get their pay or the hospital?
yeah.
Who got their pay?
Who got their pay?
Did they get paid to work?
No, they didn't get paid. Doc, for the care at the hospital?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No. What, the cost of care until 1974, the formula was this. The county will be responsible for the cost of care for the first 2 years. The individual is there longer than 2 years, the state will bear the cost. The probate judges determined how much a person would pay, the family would pay. There was, earlier on, there was a quite complicated, I won't go into that, but at any rate, that was generally, until 1974, the county was responsible for the cost of care for those patients they committed to a state asylum. After 2 years, the state bore the cost. Yes.
So if a patient went to work at the college, as a secretary, for example,
Yeah.
did that patient receive a check, or was
Sure.
the facility reimbursed? Was
No,
the
no,
facility
no,
paid
no.
by the employer?
No.
So they actually collected a paycheck themselves?
Sure,
Okay.
yeah. Sure, he was, he's on his own.
And was
He
it?
got his own job. We had a patient placement officer. And she went out and found some jobs that these people had an aptitude for, and took that job. They got paid, put it in their bank account.
Were they permitted to live out of the hospital then? Did they have to live at the hospital and work?
Pardon?
Did they have to live at the hospital and work, or did they find somewhere else to live? An apartment? Residence before the 70s? Were they allowed to live somewhere else than the hospital?
Later on, after they got some sufficient funds, they would find a place to live. We would place them on what the prison system calls parole. We called convalescent status. And that was, at that time, convalescent status was, you were not discharged absolutely from the hospital, or completely. You were allowed out for up to a year, but during that time you were monitored by our social service department. If everything was going well, at the end of that year you were discharged. Yeah, sure, they moved out. Yes.
Doctor, the medical records on the patients, were they destroyed when Newberry was closed, or are they in a cardboard box someplace?
A good question. Those records were sent to the Michigan Library in Lansing. I can't assure you that they still have them. When I retired from Kalamazoo in 1987, We had every record, we had a record of every patient that had been admitted there from August 29, 1959 to the date I left. After I left, Steve saw some boxes that were of records that were being sent to Lansing, to the library up there. Now, try and get at those records, very, very difficult. They claim they're confidential and almost impossible to get them. I was telling your wife that I have been in contact with an attorney in Grosse Pointe, and she had a relative at one of the hospitals, and she tried to get the records of that relative, and they were denied. She told me the last time I communicated with her that she was going to file a suit demanding the change in the law that after a certain number of years that relatives, if they could establish that they were bona fide records, could have access to those records. She said, my word, after so many years, the patient is dead. Many of that was years ago, and there's no reason why the relatives shouldn't have access to those records. So I'll check with her. I promised your wife I would check with her and let her know.
You would think it would be important to the family.
Sure it is.
In case there's anything hereditary.
Yeah, exactly.
There'd be a legitimate reason for getting a hold of those records.
You don't have to convince me. When I was superintendent at the hospital, if somebody could establish that they were bona fide relatives, I gave them access to the records. There was no hassle. But that law has changed. Yeah.
Dr. Decker, the lady who had been in charge for a certain time period at the state hospital medical records told me, didn't Marie Moiseo tell us that they were ordered to destroy the records there? And they did? Yeah, some of them at least.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to ask you though, could you comment on the duration and the purpose of the Sault State Hospital? The duration and the purpose of the Sault State Hospital, how long it lasted and what function it served in the Department of Mental Health system? The Sault State Hospital?
Why don't
The
you
old
go
Army
up there?
base, the one
Yeah,
here.
go up there, because he can't hear you.
Yeah.
No, the Sault State Hospital, if you could comment on that.
Oh, yeah,
Duration
okay,
and
the Sault
purpose.
State Hospital. Yeah, well, this was always true, until those drugs came in 55. That the hospitals were always overfilled, overcrowded. And in 1945, the state was able to forge a contract with the Army for, in the Sioux here, for the camp that you had here, the Army camp. And patients, fairly docile patients from Pontiac, Kalamazoo, Traverse City, were moved up here to the Sioux, to that fort. And they were here until 1950. Then the federal government said, we want this back again. We want this land back. So they terminated the lease and closed the hospital in 1950.
From what I read about the Sault State Hospital, I couldn't glean anywhere where there were any UP residents placed there. If even Sioux people, if they needed to be hospitalized, went to Newberry rather than the Sioux. I think. Could you hear me okay?
No.
Okay.
Got all those questions, you might as well stay sitting right here.
See, he filters all of his language through his beard.
The Sault State Hospital.
Yeah.
I couldn't find anywhere where anybody from the Sioux had gone there as a patient. Of course, the employees were mostly from this area. But
Yeah.
the patients, if they needed to be hospitalized, went to Newberry, I believe. They didn't go to the Sioux.
That's true, Jim,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, they came. They were overflows from the other hospitals.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if it's sort of transitional. It was sort of transitional until they found somewhere else for
Yeah.
them, wasn't it, the same
Yeah.
hospital?
Okay. Yes,
I have a curiosity, you likely lost.
come up here.
You likely lost patients who passed away while they were in your facilities. What would have become of their remains? Would they be released back to their family, or like in the case of a TB patient, would they have to
Yeah.
be buried somewhere
Yeah,
on
yeah.
the hospital grounds?
Yeah.
or-
Well, you know, I thought that at Kalamazoo, they were never buried on the hospital grounds. They were buried in what they call Pauper's Field in one of the hospitals in the city. At Traverse City, likewise, their cemetery there, they're buried in this cemetery. There's a big field in back where they had all of the dead buried from Traverse City Hospital. But yeah, none of the graves were marked. Only 3. There were 3 marked there, and I got photos of those 3 over there. The man in charge over there was very gracious. He found those 3 for me and photographed them and sent those photographs. But there's one big field there full of graves. You know, in many of these state hospitals, what happened oftentimes if the patient was indigent, died, the body was there, they went to the anatomy department at Ann Arbor. And what they do with them there?
Dissect them, sure.
Cadavers.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. When I went to medical school at Wayne State University in Detroit, and down in the basement were these huge vats of bodies in formaldehyde, and you know, boards on top, weighing them down. And of course, one of the first courses in medical school was dissection. Yeah.
So what did they do with the bodies from Newberry? That's what she was asking. What happened to the people that died at the hospital in Newberry?
In Newberry.
That I don't know.
Yeah, I think I can answer that. They were mostly buried at the Potter's Field area of the Forest
Yeah.
Home Cemetery, which was the Newberry Cemetery.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, if people who didn't have relatives who wanted to pick up the bodies or didn't have any resources and so on.
Now, you know, this hospital that flew over the cuckoo's nest, many of those people were incinerated, and they had a whole room full of like beer cans with the ashes. Okay, well, I see that Sue is anxious there to get out of here.
You can't close the library till
Now
now.
you're all,
That's right.
you're all welcome to buy a book, and I tell you that there's no limit, you can buy as many as you wish.
And then it looks like there's also some pictures around the room that you can take a look at also, and maybe ask them some more questions if you can catch them. So anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Decker. We really